This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship.
About engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues.
And how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. Today we're going to talk about climate change, the environment, and how the pandemic that we're still living through has affected those issues, the ways those issues play out in our world, and also the way we view them, and talk about policy around those issues. And we're very fortunate to have a leading scholar and colleague and good friend, Sheila Olmstead, on the podcast again. I think she was with us a little more than a year ago to talk about some of these issues. It must have been more than a year ago, Sheila, right? Because it was before the pandemic. So
right, there's a compression of time makes it very hard to tell. But I'm glad to be back.
Well, we're delighted to have you on. Sheila Olmstead, as I'm sure many of our listeners know, is a professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs here at the University of Texas. She's also a university fellow at Resources for the Future and a senior fellow at the Property and Environment Research Center. Professor Olmstead is a charter member of the Science Advisory Board at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And from 2016 to 2017, she served in the White House in the really important role of senior economist for energy and environment on the President's Council of Economic Advisors. Professor Olmstead has published, as far as I can tell, in every major science and related economics journal that covers environmental issues, publishing in journals that reach wide academic as well as public and policy audiences. And so we really have the best person on to talk about these issues. Thank you again for joining us, Sheila.
Well, thanks for that kind introduction.
And before we get into our discussion, of course, we have our scene-setting poem from Mr. Zachary Suri. What is your poem titled today, Zachary?
Fuelless.
Fuelless. All right, let's hear it.
Children are supposed to be curious, to be trusting. Not this stare from the bus stop at you in the SUV, idling through the streets of early morning sunrise. It rises only while it can still be seen. Not this stare from the bus stop. I too am disappointed. Now that we are adjusted to the mundane apocalypse, the everyday end of the world, I feel they have a right to know what it cost us, because it will cost them even more. I tell you, carpe diem before it all goes dark. Treasure this winter of our discontent before the summer of no end. Remember, the world will burn, etc., until it is fuelless.
Wow. What is your poem about, Zachary?
My poem is really about the ways in which we've become desensitized to the scale of tragedy around us, not just in terms of the human tragedy of the pandemic, but also the tragic impact of our own actions on the climate and on the earth.
Sure. Well, Sheila, that seems like a good place to ask, I guess, the biggest question: how has this pandemic contributed to the environmental challenges and opportunities that we face today?
It's a great question, and sort of opens a set of what I think are really interesting topics. I think I appreciate in Zachary's poem, that effort of art to try and help us do better at understanding problems at such a large scale. Like if you think this week about those tiny white flags on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., right? That effort to try and put in human terms, right? Something that's just so just horrific, right? So, approaching 700,000 deaths now with the pandemic.
Right.
And then, as Zachary said, it's just as hard, if not harder, for people to, kind of put in human terms this idea that we are, rapidly warming the planet much more rapidly than we have in the past. And that has some really, really significant implications. I guess I would start by saying, we've learned again that, the households that are the most vulnerable, the communities that are the most vulnerable to the impacts of the pandemic are also in some cases those that are most vulnerable to the downsides of climate change, that poverty constrains resilience and adaptation, and vulnerability in all its forms constrains resilience and adaptation. So if you just think about, what happened when Hurricane Ida came through coastal Louisiana, again, another, large coastal storm that rapidly intensified as it approached the land. And again, we see communities that are that are flooded are communities that struggle in so many different ways. And again, the same thing it has been true of the pandemic, that if you think about the impacts on households, that have frontline workers that can't work from home or lost their jobs or, cannot take off, time to get their vaccine. These are the households that have been, or those that suffer from, significant health impacts of long-run poverty and, differential treatment according to race and the healthcare system and so on. So it's sort of both of these crises highlight for us that sense that, we're not doing as much as we could, in a wealthy society, to help those households that are most vulnerable. So that's one thought that comes to mind. I think a second one is that, it reminds us, both of these crises remind us just how hard what we would call collective action problems are, right? We have sort of a second set of depressing lessons in, second set meaning with the pandemic, right? The climate crisis we've been struggling with for many decades. And we need to reduce emissions or sequester emissions, right? And when households and firms and cities and states and countries do that, they get some benefits from that activity, but they bear all of the costs. And similarly, in the pandemic, we need to reduce transmission. And so we can take steps like sheltering in place, essentially, or masking, as a family, or in schools or in the workplace, getting vaccines. And we can take those measures and we get some of the benefits from those measures, but we bear all of the costs. And in both cases, we see people and communities and states and countries that are reluctant, to bear those costs in a world in which it's possible to just, do nothing, right? Sort of free ride on the actions of others. And so, seeing these differing propensities for altruism and public-mindedness, it just reminds us that, these are both really difficult situations, that incentives matter, that we have to make it as easy as possible to do the right thing. And still, we don't get necessarily as far as we had hoped. So I think those are two kind of important parallels. And I guess the last thing I would say to answer your first question is, we've seen, of course, with a big reduction in economic activity around the world related to the world shutting down, starting around March of 2020, starting, in Asia well before that, but the rest of the world following pretty closely in early 2020. Really big drops in greenhouse gas emissions, and those were detectable, and there's a lot of reporting about that. You think about the scale of that: aircraft are grounded, no one's commuting to work by car, all kinds of energy, consumption was falling at the time. And so that drop that we saw in greenhouse gas emissions, those emissions that are changing the global climate, in 2020, it was a drop of about 10% year on year. And that's the largest annual drop we've seen since World War II. So, I mean, it was bigger than the Great Recession, which dropped emissions by about 6%, and lower for the first time since 1990 than 1990 emissions. So that was a big drop. So we've learned how much impact, our economic activity, just our regular economic activity, has on emissions. But all these changes were temporary. And so some, I think, are using this as a political opportunity to say, hey, look, sort of pushing an anti-climate change policy agenda. See how poorly the economy fares when we reduce emissions dramatically. And that's not a very fair comparison. It's a bit of a red herring. Right? It's very costly, obviously, to reduce emissions in that way, right, by shutting everything down. But the policy prescriptions for doing this cost effectively are not emphatically shut everything down. And so that's, I think, an important point to realize, too, is that there are many less costly ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so we might take as a lesson the drop in emissions as an important point, but not, obviously the economic disruption that it caused as necessarily, what we would see with serious climate change policy.
Is there, Sheila, a direct relationship between the spread of the pandemic and climate issues? Can we see something there?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are a few direct connections. So the first one I would note would be there are some common links at the root of the two phenomena. So one of the, big sources of emissions, especially in the past couple of years, is deforestation, especially deforestation by burning, of forests in the tropics and elsewhere as well. We see that with wildfires in North America and so on as well. And deforestation, causes the movement of animals like bats, right, in the case of coronavirus, to places where they're more likely to come into contact with people. And so one cannot draw a direct line between, right, the emergence of COVID-19 as a human disease, right, as a deadly human disease, and climate change per se. But, you can say, look, there's this tendency for this, kind of zoonotic spillover to happen where we have deforestation, and deforestation is also a really important climate change driver. So, there are other common links too, but I think it's important to think about those. And then I think the second thing I would say is that we definitely also know that poor air quality increases the risk that individuals that are exposed to COVID will die from COVID-19. And so it's similar to the effects of smoking, an additional stressor on people's lungs. And the evidence that's racking up for this is from China and from various parts of the United States, and it's pretty convincing. And so again, right, you can think about the fact that we have to live with climate change and we have to live with global pandemics. And if we expect that to be true in both cases going forward, then many of the things that we would redo to reduce emissions, that are correlated with those greenhouse gas emissions, like particulate matter emissions and others, would also improve people's health outcomes, right, with or without the pandemic. So there are several important links, and it's a really good idea for us to be mindful of those.
So, looking at something like the vaccine during a pandemic, it's I think in many ways shows the role that technology can play in responding to these big collective action issues. What do you think that experience during the pandemic tells us about the role of technology in our solutions to climate change or attempts to solve climate change?
Yeah, it's a great question. So what I would say is, when you think about what the world did, and just as an example, the sort of U.S. government support for rapid development of vaccines. But even without that, right, there certainly were, I think the Pfizer and Moderna, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe that those were supported by by the operation, forgetting the name.
Warp speed.
Yes, thank you, Operation Warp Speed. It was a mix, right?
Yes.
Some of the vaccines that were developed in the U.S. were supported by the U.S. government, and others were not. And that's what we see, with respect to climate technologies as well, technologies that will help this kind of transition that we're experiencing to cleaner energy, which is necessary to stop the rapid warming of the planet, or at least to slow the rapid warming of the planet. And so, people have asked, well, if we can do that so quickly and turn on a dime, right, and, create these amazing inventions, the vaccines that have saved so many lives, couldn't we do that also for the climate crisis? I mean, obviously, there are lots and lots of U.S. research dollars and research dollars from governments around the world that have gone into technologies like, solar and wind energy and, lots of other technologies that are helping with the energy transition, but nothing near the kind of scale, in the short run, right? Sort of treating the situation as a crisis as what we saw with the vaccines. And I think it's a great reminder that the power of governments to make those huge investments, right, that no single private firm could hope to make, especially in the short run. They can be very powerful and they can work out quite well.
Do you also see a connection between the anti-science rhetoric surrounding the vaccine and a lot of the sort of very ignorant reactions we've seen in the past few decades to climate change science?
I do. I think you see some of the same individuals, especially in the political sphere, right, espousing both, right? Skepticism of, hard science that's coming either from academic institutions or from scientists within the government. That's especially distressing to see, politicians and even the executive branch directly attacking, science from its own employees on a regular basis. I think that's been hard to watch, and it's been hard to see, some of the brain drain that we've seen in some of the agencies on, that have worried about climate. But, honestly, we see some of that same debate and discussion, between the FDA and the CDC, right, and the White House over, issues having to do with the pandemic. There's a real strain. I think maybe Jeremy's the better expert on this, probably always historically has been some of this in the United States, but it's really grown, and been pretty destructive in the past several years. This tendency of people to be, skeptical of science and skeptical of, of scientific expertise, and it slows us down, right? It
Right.
slows us down in getting vaccines into arms. It slows us down in doing something about, the greenhouse gas emissions that are changing the climate. Eventually, often, the U.S. does the right thing, but it's just that whether what the cost will be of being slower to action, due in part to this skepticism of the science. It's hard to say.
Well, and it's hard to avoid, I think, Sheila, the obvious conclusion that people have died because of our slow reaction or a mixed reaction, both on the climate and particularly on the pandemic issue, right?
Yes, I think that's fair to say. I think with climate, the best links in terms of kind of most well-established empirical links in the literature are between, increasing heat and this, increasing
Yes.
frequency and intensity
Yes.
of heat waves and human mortality and morbidity, as well as, things like coastal storms. It's a little harder to say in those cases because in the case of storms, they're pretty infrequent events. And so the best we can do is what scientists would call attribution science that tells us, how much more likely it is that we would have a Hurricane Harvey or Hurricane Ida than it might have been without anthropogenically induced climate change. And those numbers look awfully convincing to me. But again, we can't make that direct link and say, right, this storm is happened because the climate is changing.
Right.
But for sure, right, kind of given what we know, to the extent that we can attribute some of that increased intensity and frequency and the kind of rapidity with which the storms increase in strength before they meet houses and buildings, to climate change, that has been responsible, for some pretty significant human costs. I mean, the Texas winter storm is another classic example of that.
Right. That's just what I was thinking of. All of those who died around the state of Texas because they lost power.
Right. And then there again, sort of similar to the pandemic in the sense that it's not just that people froze to death in their homes, right, or died from carbon monoxide exposure in their homes, but that they couldn't get to the hospital, right? Similarly
Exactly.
with the pandemic, right, we have, long waits to get an ICU bed. So it's, it's not just COVID that kills people, it's the, the lack of access to rapid and high quality medical care.
So I think that's a good point to transition, Sheila. You're so closely in touch with the policy community, both those in government and many of those outside of government. How has the pandemic changed the way policy experts and policymakers think about some of these issues?
If I were to say one thing, I got to say it's a little bit of a downer. And you know me, I'm an optimist, so I don't like to focus on the negative. But I think the pandemic has further polarized the political setting in the U.S. kind of federal, right, in the Congress for sure, and possibly, in other settings as well. And so at a moment when, at the beginning of the Biden administration, there are some pretty ambitious targets on the table for reducing U.S. greenhouse gas emissions and doing something serious about the climate. We are also at a moment where it's extraordinarily difficult to get any of that done. And I think we're seeing that with respect to the infrastructure bill that the Congress is currently considering, and recognizing that maybe the climate pieces of that bill are among the most vulnerable pieces, right? If we're to get to some agreement in which that passes through, it may be, without some of its major climate provisions. And that would really be difficult to accept because it is the sort of centerpiece of the current Biden administration approach. I know they've got some other things up their sleeve, and things can change and so on. But with an election coming up in 2022, if the prospects for this bill don't start looking better, you have to wonder how much concrete territory they're going to cover on climate change in this first term.
And why do you think this has become more politicized? Is it simply because there is a set of political actors, particularly from one party, who have tried to politicize these issues, or are there other factors as well? Is there uncertainty about some of the things we thought we knew that has affected this debate?
I think that if anything, on the second point, what we know and what even, quite conservative politicians are willing to accept in terms of the basic science, I actually sense a subtle shift in that. And I, from what I am reading, I think people are actually more willing to talk about climate change and the fact that many of the phenomenon that we're experiencing, are linked to it. Even, folks from heavy fossil fuel producing states. I'm not sure about the Texas delegation, but I do know, for example, that Senator Joe Manchin, right, when you're kind of reading what he's saying, it no longer seems to be about just outright denial, but there is a sense that people, they're extraordinarily cognizant of the costs of serious climate policy and not really clear on the benefits. And they're also highly aware of the distribution of those, somewhat lopsided costs and benefits, and which states are going to lose and which states stand to gain from serious climate policy. And so that's, I think, where we are. And I think the other piece of it is, an unwillingness to kind of hand a democratic administration a victory of any kind. Right. So there's even though there may be a better understanding, better agreement on, on the basic science and what the concerns are, I think for those two reasons, we're just not seeing the progress that we need to see.
And what's your sense about public opinion in general? It seems to me, but I'm not an expert, it seems to me that public opinion is every year more and more concerned about climate change and more committed in one way or another to addressing the issue. Obviously, the devil's in the details, but is that a fair reading of where you think the public's going?
I think that's a fair reading. Again, I think we're probably reading some of the same things. I mean, I see that too, and it certainly has been noted in the literature. Kind of, academic research has suggested, polling, right, suggests that. I think it's one of several important examples of, the failure of the U.S. political system to deliver on, issues that seem to be, increasingly important to the people that the system governs. And it's hard to say why that is. Again, I'm sure you've had lots of conversations on this show about gerrymandering and, right, all kinds of, reasons why the, elected officials aren't necessarily catering to their median voter anymore, right? But I think we got to put this right now, right, on in the ledger of issues that have not, where the action has not necessarily, it doesn't agree very well with, I think, where people stand.
Right. It would fall under that category, I think, that we've talked about quite a bit on the podcast, which is the failure of democracy in a particular area where it can be fixed. This is not an inevitable failure of democracy, but it does seem in the institutional matrix that we're in now that this is where we are.
I think that's right. And I don't think you can lay it at the feet. I don't want people to come away from the conversation with this impression that I think we can lay this entirely at the feet of Republican politicians. I think Democratic politicians have also been kind of loath to give in on some favorite, sort of favorite items that aren't necessarily going to work for finding areas of compromise. So I'll give you an example. Comprehensive carbon pricing is not really something that's been seriously considered, even though right at the beginning of the administration, there might have been some appetite for that among some of the conservative, especially the sort of the Republicans who have signed on to, these climate groups within the Congress and so on. I think we're, unfortunately, as we approach 2022 now, when that gets closer, it gets harder to do things that might have been accomplished, in the first, year or two. But I do worry, right, that that Democrats, kind of hanging on to their favorite policies and not necessarily kind of moving towards something that might be more of a compromise have contributed to the problem as well.
Sure. That's the paradox of polarization, that both sides end up playing the game they're criticizing.
Right.
That doesn't mean they're playing it equally, by the way. There's an asymmetry, certainly,
yes.
But nonetheless, I think your point is so well taken. So Sheila, where do we go from here? What do experts like yourself, who also have a very strong dog in the game, right, who really want to see certain solutions pursued, where do we go from here? How can we see this history that we've discussed contributing to some progress in the future?
I think there are a couple of areas that one could focus on. I mean, one is, spending serious money to address this first issue that we talked about, which is, hey, there are a lot of households and firms and, buildings and so on in the United States that are really vulnerable to, not just coastal storms, but inevitably inundation, right? Permanent flooding and, heat waves and these other things that, fires, things that we're seeing like that. And I think, states and the federal government are probably going to make a lot more progress talking about how we can help with adaptation and resilience. Because for better or for worse, that means, spending a lot of money and benefiting communities that are struggling, than in reducing emissions. I think that's just a harder conversation. And I think the country kind of politically, especially on the conservative side, might be more ready to talk about, hey, what do we do, for relief, and what do we do to, help bolster these communities that are so vulnerable than they are about reducing emissions. So that's one area where I think we could see some progress. And the other is something that you and I have talked about before. I think I did a short talk to some diplomats in training for a group that you were working with here in Austin. And that is recognizing that there are certain things we can do that do reduce emissions that also improve health and welfare of local populations. Things like reducing other, particulate matter emissions and other emissions that are directly causing, asthma and premature mortality and so on in the communities where these emissions occur. And a lot of the things that firms and others would do to reduce those emissions are also things that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Not all of them by any means, but, moving more rapidly from coal to gas or coal to, renewables and electricity generation is a good example of that. So I think maybe focusing on those local benefits, which are just, right, from that collective action perspective, just easier to,
Right.
To talk about and easier to get people behind doing something about. That could be really helpful too. So those are my two thoughts on that.
And I remember that talk, which was a wonderful talk you gave, and the diplomats, I think, took a lot away from it. They were struck, though, that you didn't emphasize things like the big international agreements.
Yeah, I think this is not to say, I think that process run through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has been incredibly valuable for many, many reasons. But when I think about whether that process moving forward and achieving its many different goals has been helpful to the U.S. conversation on climate change policy, I'm not so sure about that. And again, in the current political climate, with skepticism about global engagement generally, right? I think it can be, it's not as powerful as it has been in many other countries.
That makes sense. Final question, Sheila. Do you have optimism, and what makes you most optimistic?
I'm optimistic that we'll do something to avoid, some of the most serious, implications of climate change. I just think, again, with this movement of public opinion and so on, that we can't be stuck in this trap of, right, a frozen political apparatus forever, and that this will be one of the many issues that helps us bust through that, that constraint. What makes me optimistic? Again, I just, teaching our students, right? Young people are impatient. They are tired of the mess that we've made of this world, right? And I just don't see that is sustainable for any, reasonable period of time. They're revolutionaries, right? Our young people are in my classes and so on. So I feel optimistic that the pressure for change will just get greater and greater, and I feel sad that we've left it to, future generations to solve the problem, but that is what we've done. But I think they're up to it. I do. That's the optimistic part, is I think they're up to it.
You've articulated so well one of our key themes week in and week out, which is how change comes with generational change as well as policy change. Zachary, does that resonate with you? Do you share Sheila's optimism about your generation? Are you going to correct the mistakes of those before you?
I just think that this climate science has been so embedded, at least into everyday classroom interactions, and the learning of young people like myself, that I really do think that we're going to be the generation that makes a difference, and I hope soon, because it needs to happen. It needs to happen soon.
Agreed.
Well, Zachary and I have been talking about this. I hope our listeners, especially after our discussion of the German elections a couple of weeks ago, have been paying attention. Not only following Sheila's discussion, have young people made a difference in Germany already in a stronger Green Party. They also are pushing for reducing the voting age to 16.
Wow.
And this might be one of those issues where that would really help, right, Sheila?
Yeah, I think that it would. I think that it would. I don't think that's going to happen in the United States, Jeremy, but
no, not immediately, but who would have thought in 1959 that we'd lower the voting age to 18, right?
That's true. That's an excellent point. It's true.
Sheila, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us and also giving us some optimism. Really wonderful talking to you. Thank you.
It was fun. Thanks for having me on.
And Zachary, thank you for your poem and your insights as always. And thank you most of all to our listeners for joining this episode of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harris Codini.
Stay tuned for a new episode every week.
You can find This Is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher.
See you next time.